I don't. I mean, I think, I mean, even just in kind of regular parlance, I think probably 10 or 20 years ago, if somebody said, whoa, you're a rock star, I might have thought, oh, that's cool or that's fun. But then you start to, if you hear it for 20 more years, it's just like badass. These are just terms that actually don't mean anything. And I feel like rock star is an interesting way to talk about a queer female who writes out of an experimental tradition. Do you know? I mean, I think that it's a way of avoiding class, avoiding gender, avoiding experimentation, avoiding the avant-garde, and kind of commodifying it in one thing that says they're cool. Whereas I think that, again, I think male writers tend to get described as authors of the writing that they actually do and the kind of lineage that they come out of, and none of that is articulated by that word. So it's just like, I find it sort of irritating, but again, I can't stop it. It's not worth having a battle over it, but it does seem like it collapses an awful lot of details, and somehow it's reductive, I think. It's so many different things. I mean, it's funny. It's sort of like, I think to be a poet is to do something entirely impractical. And it's to be a poet is to do something entirely luxurious, to decide that the purpose of your life is to kind of spend time writing these short lines and just sort of inventorying your existence in some way in relationship to the whole history of poetry. So I think it's a very anti-capitalist gesture, and to the extreme, And I think it's funny. I mean, like, this goes back a little bit to the last question, but I think it's not unrelated. Like, the way I feel like I do warm up to the rock star term, and this is, is that I think I think in the 70s and 80s, it was a very natural move for poets to start bands, to make a band. That was how, because poetry was very fashionable in the 70s, and in the 80s it was not fashionable. And so performance art had a lot more thunder, and so did music. And so a lot of poets I knew started bands, and I just knew that I had the capacity to get about one thing together. And so poetry was that thing. I had that going, and I was developing a community, and I was beginning to publish my work, and that was good. And I knew that if I extended myself into starting a band, I just wouldn't, all of it would go off. I mean, I would have a bad band, I would be a terrible poet, and I would just lose the tiny purchase on order and progress that I possessed. And so I thought of not being a musician and not starting a band as a conceptual gesture. Like, I didn't even need to do that. I felt like I was like a person without a band, and that seemed very cool. And I even think I probably deliberately dressed like somebody who was in a band, well, without having a band, and definitely made jokes when I would read sometimes, like, about, you don't see my band, but they're here, and so on. But I think, so I mean, I think that poetry has a relationship to a particular culture, and you're the spokesman for that too, and I think you always do get, in a way, kind of produced and distributed according to what culture sees you as theirs, and that we all kind of, what's in the poem and what's on the poet become a kind of I mean, I can think of a poet as a professional person in a way. You've just taken your existence and you seep this substance, and then that becomes your life and your container and your identifier. So it's pretty, I think it's pretty remarkable, as a profession, as a vocation, and it does, I mean, vocation too works as an ex-Catholic. I think that, saints were kind of these free-form figures. They were the stars of Catholicism and the schools that I went to, and they were all these freaks, and so there was a space for that too, that and now, I mean, I think politicians are kind of like poets, and poets are like politicians too, without a party. I mean, there's a wonderful Ken Russell film. I think what is it called? It's about Byron and all the romantic poets. It's kind of it's a film in which they're kind of like stars, and it's very good. I mean, I guess New York is like a big studio, you know? I mean, it's just like, it is definitely, I mean, when I came here, it just without, I mean, I came here very much, quote, to be a poet, though briefly to be a graduate student. And when I dropped out, it was sort of like falling, you know, I was like, oh my God, where am I? And I was in New York, and that had to be somehow the container for the experience I was having, which was this not knowing part of my life. I mean, it's so interesting to be New York or anywhere during the pandemic, because we're constantly realizing that we don't know the shape of the place that we're in, and we don't know where it's going. We don't know its dimensions. We don't know how long. We don't know what real life will be like when it comes back. Will there be a new normal? And I felt like there was some of that when I first came here, you know, and that the only thing I knew was this city, you know, and so kept landing on it as, you know, kind of an extension or a definition of my subjectivity, you know. And it was the place where I learned that people who did things reached out to other people who did the same thing and became part of a group. You know, I didn't understand that when I was growing up, that you affiliated. I mean, I guess I was a loner in some way, even though I had lots of different gangs of kids I hung out with. But I think I didn't understand about affiliating with people like you. And the first people I met in New York, it seemed like all their friends were writers. All their friends are poets. And I was like, isn't that wrong or weird or using people? I couldn't quite understand the value of community until I started to experience it. And New York is where, you know, because one of the things that's so great about here is that you will always find a lot of people who want the same thing you want, you know, and they're here and you can find them. And so that became a project when I first got here to find those people, and then find within that set, you know, a subset of the ones that I really liked, and then the people who were writing work that I liked and where I belonged and where I was accepted or celebrated. And so the city was all those things. And I think, and it wasn't really until the 90s, I think actually it's interesting, Chelsea Girls was the turning point, because when I had a publisher and I had all these chapters and I had a manuscript, I needed to make a book, which I had never done before. I had created a book of poetry, but I had never created a novel. And so I needed to go to an artist colony or a place. And I think I had been to one artist colony before that. And so I applied to 4 different colonies and they all rejected me. And I just was in a complete tizzy, like what's gonna, you know, and I just by accident, I went to visit the studio of a friend who was an artist who was quite wealthy. And I felt like even as I was going, I was thinking, why am I doing this? Why am I wasting my time going to see this rich woman and her work? And when I was with her, she was like, what are you doing this summer? And I told her, I don't know. I had just gotten rejected by all these artist colonies. And she said, well, we have a little house in the country you could use. And I, you know, and it turned out to be like an estate. It was a 70-acre, you know, land, kind of, landmark German farmhouse. I mean, it was crazy. And so that's where I finished editing Chelsea Girls. It was phenomenal. I felt like royalty, you know. There was no artist colony that was as good as this place, you know. And so and the question was there. I thought, how do I write? I wrote a lot of poetry there. And I thought, you know, I wrote poems while I was working, and it was fun to kind of turn my city chops into rural ones. It was different. It was slower, but it was similar in a way. We just had to act like the tree that was there was the same as the person on the street who was there, you know.